All right, so this cycle, we're talking about coral reefs. And last cycle, we talked about where the land meets the ocean, and then we also talked about where rivers meet the ocean. And remember, I said we're going to start at the edge, and then we move our way out and then down. Yeah? So this cycle, we're going to go out into the ocean, farther out, and we are going to be looking at the coral reefs, which are found on the continental shelf. Do you guys remember from first semester what the continental shelf is? Yes. Okay. So what is it?
It's like it's a different plate, so it's like the plate where the continents are, and it goes down the oceanic plate.
Okay. Yes. It's the extension of the continents into the ocean, right? Okay. So you have like the extension of the continent into the water, shelf break, slope, rise, abyssal plain. Yeah? Remember that?
Yes.
Okay. And so this is like our land. Here's our water. Okay. So up here would be where the intertidal zone would be, right? The places that gets covered and uncovered by the tides every day, also estuaries. Coral reefs are located on the continental shelf. So coral reefs will be located like here, okay? So they need relatively shallow water. This is shallow water compared to the open ocean, which like over the abyssal plain, that can be miles deep, okay? Whereas this will be over the continental shelf, maybe like 600 feet or maybe more, but compared to the open ocean, that is very, very shallow water. Yeah? So remember that? Okay, so we're going to be looking at coral reefs, which are an ecosystem that are located here over the continental shelf. We'll also be looking at a couple other ecosystems on the continental shelf, like kelp forests. Okay, we'll look some more at kelp forests. We'll also look at like sandy bottom habitats and rocky bottom habitats, and then the neritic zone, which is the water just above the continental shelf. Okay, so lots of types of things that are found here. All right, but first thing that we'll look at is coral reefs. So in order to understand what a coral reef is, you need to understand what a reef is, okay, or have a definition of a reef. And a reef is simply a rigid biological structure, okay, construction, typically formed in shallow water. So rigid biological construction typically formed in shallow water. So biological, that means it's formed by living things. Okay, so it's a reef. A reef is formed by living things. Rigid, meaning it's got like substance to it. Okay, it can stand on its own. All right, and it's typically found in shallow water. That is not true for all reefs. You do actually have deep sea corals. They're going to be different from our shallow water corals, but for the most part, reefs are found in shallow water. So remember when we talked about estuaries, we talked about some of the habitats that are associated with estuaries, and one of those things is an oyster reef. Okay, oyster reefs are rigid biological constructions formed in shallow water, and they're formed by oysters. So oysters are living things. When they all kind of like cement together, they form these big structures of all of these oysters, and it's called an oyster reef. Okay, so you get oyster reefs. That picture is this picture right here on the left. That's an oyster reef. You also get reefs that are formed by worms. So the middle picture is a worm reef. Basically, worms can form like tubes, like rocky tubes that they live in, and they grow on top of each other and can form reefs. And then you also have blue-green algae, okay, cyanobacteria that can form reefs. They're called stromatolites, found in Australia. But most of the reefs that we find worldwide and are most familiar with are formed by coral, right? The ones that we like to snorkel on, super pretty, okay, those are formed by coral. So, where do you find coral reefs worldwide? Well, everywhere that's in red is where you'd find them, which is in the tropics. Okay, the tropics. Coral reefs need two things in order to survive. They need warm water, so their water has to be greater than 20 degrees Celsius. And they need nutrient poor water. Okay, those two things are found in the tropics. Okay, again, warm water because most of the energy from the sun gets absorbed at the equator, which makes the water at the equator warmer. And then also, remember from first semester, at the equator, bless you, in the tropics you have a permanent thermocline, yeah? And so permanent thermocline equals nutrients trapped in the deep sea, so you get nutrient poor water. So those two things are found in the tropics, which is where you find coral reefs. Also remember from first semester, do you guys remember gyres? Ooh, man, we're going back to like beginning of first semester. Okay. Gyres are big whole ocean currents.
Oh.
Yeah? Okay, so they're big whole ocean currents. So, remember we have like these big currents that go like this, yeah? Big circular currents. Okay, remember that these gyres take warm water from the tropics and they transfer them up towards the poles, and then they take the cold water from the poles and transfer it down to the tropics. Okay, and so this water that's being transferred from the tropics up towards the poles is going to be warm and nutrient poor. So notice on what side of the gyre do you always find, here's the Pacific, do you always find the coral reefs? Oh, on the side that's moving away from the tropics, that's carrying that warm, nutrient poor water. And then on the other side, okay, no coral reefs here, right? Not even in the tropical regions down here, even though it's warm, it's nutrient rich, which is bad for coral. Okay? So, warm, nutrient poor water. Okay, so things that build a reef. Coral obviously builds a reef, but it has help, okay, building a reef. It's not just the coral that's responsible for the entire thing, but it is the main reef builder. You also have coralline algae and calcareous green algae. Do you remember what those were from first semester? We briefly talked about them. If you don't, that's all right. It's coralline algae is a red algae that puts calcium carbonate into their cell walls. It's a defense mechanism, so it makes them taste like chalky, right? So things don't want to eat them. And then calcareous green algae is just a green algae that does the same thing. Okay, so those two types of algae will help to build a reef. And when we actually talk about the process, we'll talk about these types of algae. And then you also get shells of mollusks and stuff that will help to build the reef as well. All right, but mostly it's coral, so that's what we're going to focus on today. So let's look at the coral animal. So corals are in the phylum Cnidaria. Whoa, more first semester stuff. Okay, phylum Cnidaria. And do you remember what class they're found in? Anthozoa, Scyphozoa, Hydrozoa, Cubozoa. Anthozoa. Good. So they are like sea anemones, right? They're basically like little mini sea anemones. Okay. They are colonial. That means that they live in a colony. Do you know what a colony of animals is? A community, like a bunch of animals all living together, right? Like a Portuguese man of war, exactly. So just to review what a anemone kind of looks like, which is what a coral is, just a mini anemone. So it's got like, the tube of tissue, the mouth at the top surrounded by tentacles, and it opens up into the gastrovascular cavity. Yeah? Okay. It also has nematocysts because it's in Cnidaria. So they do have stinging cells, and those stinging cells will be used to capture food like zooplankton, and they will eat using those nematocysts. It's actually not the main way that they get their food, but it's one of the ways. So corals are colonies. They have many animals living together, and those animals stay connected, okay, by a thin sheet of tissue. So what happens is you get the corals will release egg and sperm into the water, and those egg and sperm will meet and become a little larva. Okay, that larva will settle down onto a hard surface where it will transform and become a little polyp. Okay, so it's got a little polyp. The coral secretes a skeleton around each of the little polyps. Okay, so it secretes a calcium carbonate skeleton, like a limestone skeleton around itself. Okay, so you've got the little polyp that secretes its little coral cup, okay, little calcareous cup, and then this little coral polyp will divide asexually and create another little anemone, another coral polyp. Okay, and this little coral polyp will secrete its own little shell around itself, and then these will divide and become 4, and the 2 new ones will create their own little coral like cups that they sit in, and divide and become 8 and 16 and 32 and so on and so forth. Okay, and so they keep growing. They actually grow up and out. So you start off with the one polyp, and then it divides, becomes two, and it grows up and out as it divides. And each of those new little polyps creates their own little spot that they sit in, their own little like calcareous cup. And eventually it looks something like this, okay? And I'll pass this around, but you can look at this and you can see each of the little holes in here. This is actually where a little coral polyp would sit, okay? And so you can see just how small they are. And then they will be connected by a thin sheet of tissue. So as you look at that little piece, you can see where the little coral polyps will be. And those coral polyps remain connected, okay, with the tissue. And in that tissue that connects each of the little polyps, their digestive and their nervous system will remain connected. What that means is that if you've got like your coral colony here, okay, and this coral colony is sitting in the water and it's got water flow this way, okay, that means that as the water moves over this coral colony, this side of the colony will be exposed to lots of food, right? They'll get first shot at the food, and this side won't. So if they keep their digestive system interconnected, if these guys have an excess of food and these guys need food, they can share, and this whole colony will survive, okay? That also means, like, keeping their nervous system connected means, like, if they're all out, you know, like, feeding, and a predator comes and starts, like, nibbling on one side of the coral, it can send a signal to the rest of the coral polyps here, and they can all retract back down into their little cups that they sit in. Okay, so it helps to protect the colony as well. Does that make sense? So it helps them to survive by having those two systems remain interconnected. Okay? All right. You also have some types of corals that are just one single polyp. Okay, those are called mushroom corals. This right here is a single polyp. Okay, this would be a single polyp. This would be the mouth in the middle, okay, and then this would be covered in living tissue, and then the tentacles would be located inside of these little grooves that radiate out from the center. During the day, those tentacles would be withdrawn, and then at night, those tentacles come out so they can feed. Okay, so I'll pass this around so you can see it. It's pretty cool, but this is one single coral animal as compared to the one that we just passed around, which is many animals all living together. Okay, so you can see that. And yes, the living tissue is just on the surface. Okay. So here's a picture to kind of help you see this a little bit better. So this right here, this picture on the upper left, that's like the single polyp that's going around. This is what it looks like when it's alive during the day. Okay, at night you'd get all sorts of tentacles that would be sticking up from inside of those little grooves. This is like a close-up on the bottom right here. That's a close-up of the coral colony that's going around. Okay. So this is a close-up of this right here. So you can see each of the little polyps. Those sit in each of these little like holes that were here. And then it remains interconnected with all of that tissue. You see that? So you get both the digestive system and the nervous system connected. And so that little thin sheet of tissue would sit on top of this skeleton. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so that's what it looks like. Corals do sexual reproduction. So most of them do spawning, okay, where they will release their eggs and sperm into the water column. So they'll be broadcast spawners. Some of them will be brooders. So they will release sperm into the water, but they will keep the egg in the gastrovascular cavity, and then they'll filter water through that gastrovascular cavity to bring sperm in to fertilize the egg. And then they allow the egg to develop a little bit and then release it. So they'll do broadcast spawning or they'll be brooders. Kind of weird, but in many Pacific reef species, you get synchronous spawning. So like in the Great Barrier Reef, all of the corals spawn at the same time. Meaning like on the same night, on the same day, like they all spawn at the same time. So it's coordinated with the phase of the moon and the water temperature. So once after winter it reaches a certain water temperature, and I believe it's a neap tide, okay, at a quarter moon, they all spawn at the same time. So they all release their gametes into the water at the same time. To the point, like there's so many gametes in the water that it actually makes the water cloudy. Okay, because there's so many corals on the reef and they're all reproducing at the same time. Okay, so it does, it's called synchronous spawning, and they all spawn together. In Caribbean species of corals, they have asynchronous spawning, so certain kinds of coral will spawn on different nights. All right. Here's the life cycle of a coral. So you get your coral colony that will release sperm and eggs. Fertilization is external, happens in the water column. You get a little larva. Okay, the larva settles down onto a hard surface, transforms and becomes a polyp. Okay, that little polyp secretes its little coral cups that it sits in, called the corallite. It divides asexually, okay, and becomes a bunch of different polyps living together, and that grows and grows and grows and forms this big colony, and then that reproduces, and the life cycle starts over again. Okay? So corals can also do asexual reproduction. We actually talked about this last semester as well. So they will do fragmentation. So you get some types of coral that are much more delicate than others. And so if a storm comes and a piece of coral breaks off, that piece actually has the opportunity to grow and become a new coral colony. Okay? So it can become a new coral colony. It's an asexual form of reproduction. The big, like, brain corals, okay, those aren't going to be able to do this. Okay? But the branching corals, like the piece that I sent around and like this one up here, they'll be able to do that. All right? Make sense? Okay. Okay, so we talked about how coral reproduce. Okay, we're going to talk today about how they get their food, so how they actually obtain the energy that they need to survive and to grow and build these big giant reefs. And then we're going to talk about locations on the reef, how reefs actually form, and then locations on the reef, and then the types of reefs. Okay, and then that's what we're looking at doing today. So coral get their nutrition from algae that live inside of their bodies. Okay, so remember we talked about how corals need to be in nutrient-poor water, and it kind of doesn't make sense, right? Because you're like, hey, these animals, they need nutrients, they need to grow. Why do they need to be in nutrient-poor water? Well, they need to be in nutrient-poor water because of the zooxanthellae, which is the algae that lives inside of them. So they actually have a mutualistic relationship with this algae, and they're little single-celled algae that live inside of their bodies. And those little algae, the zooxanthellae, do photosynthesis, right? Because they're plants. So they do photosynthesis, and they give the coral oxygen and glucose. Okay, so oxygen for respiration and glucose for getting energy, right? And then so the corals will take that oxygen and glucose, and they will do cellular respiration and pass to the zooxanthellae the carbon dioxide and all of the nutrients and stuff that they need for photosynthesis. So it's a mutualistic relationship. So corals get, depending on who you ask, you'll hear anywhere between 90 and 98% of their food from these zooxanthellae, okay, from these algae that live inside of them. Okay, so they are symbiotic algae that live inside of them and give them most of their food. These zooxanthellae are found only in shallow water reef-building corals. Okay, you do get deep sea corals that will form, but because they're deep sea, they actually don't have the zooxanthellae that live inside of them because they don't need it, because they live away from the sun. So the zooxanthellae wouldn't help them anyways because they can't do photosynthesis. So these pictures are to kind of help you see, kind of visualize what this looks like. So you get, if you look at like your brain coral, okay, if you take a little piece of the brain coral and you zoom in, you'll see the little polyps on there. If you take the little polyps and you look at those under the microscope, see all these like dots? Okay, those are the little single-celled algae living inside of the coral. Okay. A couple more pictures just to help you see. So see the brown spots on this? Okay, that's where the zooxanthellae are. Okay? So coral gets sugar and oxygen, and the zooxanthellae get carbon dioxide and fertilizer. So why does this explain why corals need to be found in nutrient-poor water? Well, remember, what are the two things that phytoplankton need to bloom? Light and nutrients. Okay, so they're in the tropics, so there's lots of light. If there were lots of nutrients, okay, in the tropics, you would get a big old phytoplankton bloom. Okay, well, phytoplankton, when they bloom, they make the water more murky. Okay, so they actually cut off sunlight from things that are down deeper in the water. Okay, and since corals need to be attached to a hard surface, they're attached down here at the bottom. If you get a phytoplankton bloom up here, those phytoplankton absorb all the sunlight, and now all of a sudden the corals that are down deeper in the water, they're not getting sunlight. And the zooxanthellae that are living inside of them that need that sunlight to do photosynthesis to feed the coral don't get sunlight, they can't do photosynthesis, and the coral doesn't get food, and now the coral is in trouble and can die. Okay? So they need that nutrient-poor water in order to prevent phytoplankton blooms so they can get sunlight for their zooxanthellae. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's why they need to live in nutrient-poor water. Picture of coral. Okay. So that's how zooxanthellae are the way that coral get most of their energy. Okay, but zooxanthellae can't do photosynthesis at night. Okay, and they are going to, corals are cnidarian, so they are going to be able to have stinging cells and get food in other ways, like being a predator. Right, so at night you'll actually see the corals unfurl, like their tentacles and stuff. They stick their tentacles out into the water and they feed on little tiny animals that are in the water, like zooplankton. Okay, so they're going to eat a bunch of different zooplankton in the water, and that's how they get more of their energy. So they'll be predators. They also, here's a picture, so you can kind of see what the coral looks like when all of its little polyps are sticking out. It kind of looks fuzzy, right, because all the polyps are unfurled. Okay, they can also get nutrition from bacteria. So they actually have bacteria that live in them, kind of more of like a commensal relationship. The bacteria kind of, get a place to live and nutrients and stuff. And the coral doesn't really care that they're there unless the coral gets desperate for food. And then the coral can absorb and eat some of those bacteria. Okay. They also have these things called mesenteric filaments. So those are actually like these kind of like coiled tubes inside of their gut, in their gastrovascular cavity, and they can actually extrude those out of their mouth and like digest things outside of their body. And it'll actually be used as part of their defense mechanism, because if two corals get too close, they can actually fight. And one coral will stick the mesenteric filaments out of its mouth and like digest the coral that's next to it, okay, or at least part of it. Okay, so they do fight, and that's one way that they can get their nutrition.